The power of play to reveal the innermost thoughts and fantasies of children is universally accepted by professionals today. And play therapy is used all over the world. Margaret Lowenfeld, British pediatrician and psychiatrist, was one of those who pioneered this revolutionary approach to treating emotionally disturbed children. But today, remarkably little is known about a woman whose work is so central to developmental psychology. This video is about Dr. Lowenfeld and her lasting legacy of therapeutic tools and theories. Who was this highly creative, innovative woman? She was a wonderful observer of children and developed theories about children's play and thought that were revolutionary.
It was her contention that infants think. Now, this was contrary to the received wisdom of the time, which was that there can be no thought without words, and obviously infants don't have words.
She created tools that enabled children to communicate without words, all widely used by therapists and educators today. She founded the Institute for Child Psychology in London, where in 1935, the first training courses in child psychotherapy were offered. She was a medical doctor among the first to make the link between emotional and physical disorders.
She had the feel of things being somatic, even before they were psychic. And that if they were psychic, they were psychosomatic, as far as she saw them.
She was an exceptional clinician who could relate to the most disturbed and difficult children.
There was an almost magical ability she had to make meaningful contact with disturbed children.
She was always attuned to the unique and the original in her child patients.
Margaret Lowenfeld was born in 1890 in London, the younger daughter of an English mother and Polish father who retained strong ties to his native land. Margaret's was a wealthy but not a happy home. Barrick Wright is Margaret Lowenfeld's nephew and the director of the Loewenfeld Trust.
And without going into a lot of detail, there was constant conflict between the two parents. And as Margaret was much more sensitive than my mother, this affected her. And I think her state can be summarized by a reply my mother gave to me when I asked her what was Margaret like as a child. And she said, "Oh, Madge was always crying."
Kathy Irwin is a Margaret Lowenfeld Research Fellow at Cambridge University, England.
One does have to ask about her own childhood and whether, in fact, some of her sensitivity to the pain of children might actually stem from her own childhood experiences. And certainly many people who knew her feel that to be so. In many respects, she had a childhood that wasn't altogether happy, but it was also a very unusual childhood which provided her with lots of assets and a rich resource which she reaped.
Margaret and her sister Helena were given exceptional educational opportunities for young women of their time. They attended Cheltenham Ladies' College and both trained as physicians. The Lowenfelds also traveled extensively and often visited their family estate in Poland.
They used to go there for holidays, had relatives all over Europe, cousins and people, and were really brought up as Europeans. She was devoted to the Polish family, she was devoted to the Polish estate, took much more interest in it than my mother did. And when the war ended, she got into one of the welfare organizations and went back to Poland on her own, because she spoke Polish fairly well, to do relief work based on the estate where she was as a child. And that became very important in her life.
Margaret Lowenfeld's mission to Poland in 1919 as a newly qualified doctor was a turning point in her life. Poland had just reemerged as a state and was still at war with Russia. The country was in chaos. Margaret was exposed to the horrors of war. She was also called upon to play numerous roles. She was a medical officer with an American relief mission working with soldiers and refugees, and also a Polish landowner powerless to help victims of war in the community. This opened within her something like the analytic experience of the therapist in training.
The living of several distinct, mutually incompatible lives did for me what the preliminary analysis does for the therapist to be. That is, it opened doors into an interior world I would not otherwise have reached.
When Loewenfeld returned to England, she found herself unable to express in words these deep conflicting emotions. This caused her to forever doubt language as a means of communication, in spite of the fact that she spoke several languages fluently.
Later, when reflecting upon these experiences, I realized that the living of roles totally different from and even hostile to each other, in a constant atmosphere of fear and with a lack of any overall direction, is of the essence of the experience of unhappy children.
The years between World Wars I and II were a period of radical change in the treatment of disturbed children.
She was very wont to say that when she started practicing in the 20s, there was no such thing as child psychiatry. Indeed, there was no such thing as child psychiatry recognized in the key textbooks until 1931. Up to that time, children suffered from nerves, and largely the causes were thought of as hereditary, or else needing treatment through such methods as various kinds of electrotherapy, rest, or cold baths.
Margaret Lowenfeld was one of the tiny band of women who spearheaded this change. Melanie Klein and Anna Freud were working in Europe with emotionally disturbed children as well, but from different points of view.
Psychiatry in general was ridden by tribal religious doctrinal warfare between the Freudians, the Kleinians, and the Jungians. But when you came to child psychotherapy, the three great participants were Melanie Klein, Anna Freud, and Margaret Lowenfeld. And they weren't on speaking terms with each other. They all accused each other of pinching the other one's ideas and promoting them very much better.
John Hood Williams, a student of Loewenfeld's and the last director of the clinic she founded.
It's interesting that Margaret is part of a generation of quite extraordinary women. In addition to herself and her sister Helena, both of whom achieved a great deal in their respective spheres, that whole generation, born from about 1865 to 1890, produced a plethora of pioneering, energetic, achieving women. And Margaret's very definitely one of those, moving out into new fields, breaking new ground altogether, and always having to look over their shoulders.
In post-war England, male doctors were back from military service and hospital jobs hard to come by for women. Margaret decided to pursue a research career. Professor John Davis is chairman of pediatrics at Cambridge University, England.
And her study under the auspices of the Medical Research Council of rheumatism was in a way a model of its kind, and still respectable work 50 years later on. So she certainly had talents as a scientist and training as one, and actually had produced respectable scientific work before she moved into psychotherapy.
After 3 years of studying the effects of poverty on childhood diseases, Loewenfeld was convinced of the connection between mental and physical illness. In 1928, she opened her own experimental clinic for nervous and difficult children. Here, she developed her theories about play as a basis for therapy.
If we are to get in touch directly with a child's mind, if we are to know what it is really feeling and thinking, we need to learn to understand the child's natural idiom, and this is not speech, but play and action.
Margaret Lowenfeld defined play as the expression of a child's relation to the whole of life. She believed that without play, normal development is not possible. Her book, Play in Childhood, published in 1935, was the first complete study of the theories of play. In it, she defines play as applying to all activities in children that are spontaneous and self-generated, that are ends in themselves, and that are unrelated to lessons or to the child's normal physical needs.
Madeline Davis is a biographer of British child psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott. She talks about the debt of gratitude Winnicott said he owed to Margaret Lowenfeld.
Of course, she had written a book in 1935 called Play in Childhood. And out of this, I believe, he got a great many ideas, particularly perhaps the idea that playing is universal, and that children need it and that children can use it as a therapeutic process.
Play is to a child work, thought, art, and relaxation, and cannot be pressed into any single formula. It bridges the child's consciousness and his emotional experience, and so fulfills the role that conversation, introspection, philosophy, and religion fill for the adult. Play expresses a child's relation to himself and his environment, and without adequate opportunity for play, normal and satisfactory emotional development is not possible.
The importance of play was stressed by child psychoanalysts and progressive educators of the time, but Lowenfeld's approach emerged as distinctive. Her observations led her to conclude that play was not only a medium through which children master emotional conflicts, but also a cognitive process. Play, in other words, gives the therapist access to the ways in which children think.
I was struck by the need to find some means of making a closer approach to the inner experience of children. I had become profoundly impressed by the unsatisfactory nature of language as the instrument of such an exploration.
What was interesting, Loewenfeld, was an attempt to understand where children got their ideas from, what a child actually did when allowed free range with toys and other play material. What she was interested in was really trying to explore what the child thinks and what the child does. So that when, at the end of the 20s, she started her pilot study, she was coming at it with a background of, you might say, scientific inquiry into behavior.
I set out in 1928 to bring into being a set of concrete objects with which children could and would wish spontaneously to express their inner experiences and thoughts. This started as a somewhat fortuitous collection of miscellaneous objects, and in the course of years developed into the world technique.
The equipment for the world technique includes a metal tray half filled with moist sand and tools for working in it. A nearby cabinet contains drawers filled with miniature objects, living creatures, fantasy, folklore, scenery, transport. In addition, some toys are displayed on shelves. The therapist explains that there's a gap between a child's world and the world of adults, that children have many ideas and experiences which will not go into words but can be expressed in pictures. These pictures can form a bridge between the child's world and the adult's world.
Now you can take anything from anywhere, out of the drawers, off the shelves, literally anything from anywhere, to help you build up a picture. A picture which I hope will help you to understand something about what it's like to be Rodman.
The advantage of this type of material is that it allows, like a cartoon or a dream, two layers of meaning. On the surface is the actual scene, and by associative links between the scene and the child's own experience, ideas entirely different from those shown in the scene can be expressed.
Our whole emphasis is on enabling the child to discover for himself or herself what's going on inside, to work it through in the child's own way. And you ask questions, as it were, from the point of view of the child who's actually producing this world.
This is the road.
The road, yes, and goes up to round there like that, kinks around there, and comes up to the house there, yeah?
This is Mum, and this is me.
That's who?
That's me.
Oh, that's you, I see. And that's Mum there, I see. You've got that person with the big teddy bear for you.
Yes.
Looking a bit fierce, aren't you? Waving your umbrella like that. Sometimes you feel a bit fierce, do you?
Yeah.
Mm. I think I'll just leave it there for the moment because I wanted to have a chance to look at it properly, and I want to do two things with it after this. I'm going to make a drawing of it, a sort of sketch perhaps rather than a drawing, because my drawing's pretty awful. And I'm going to take a photograph. This record of an important part of the session can be studied by an outsider. The conclusions that the therapist has drawn from the world can be verified or otherwise by an independent observer.
Many workers have contributed to the study of play in children, but a tool like the world has opened up whole new vistas, whole new countries of the mind for exploration and study.
Since the parts of the brain with which one thinks are formed and active long before language is available for thought, in what way do children, before they reach this age, think and register and group their experience?
As children worked on their worlds in her clinic, Loewenfeld became increasingly puzzled by some of the material they produced. There was a whole category of worlds that defied interpretation, using the theories of classical psychoanalysis and analytic psychology. They seemed to recall and express very early childhood experiences.
And it's this kind of world that Margaret herself had to puzzle over for many years until she began to understand that these worlds represent the product of the thinking of very young children. It was her contention that infants think. Now this was contrary to the received wisdom of the time, which was that there can be no thought without words, and obviously infants don't have words.
The explanation Loewenfeld proposed was forced on her by the evidence. She was convinced by her observations that the thinking of young children was logical. She suggested that they thought in images and used an organized system to process experiences from the earliest moments of life. She first called this system of thought the primary system or proto-system, but later settled on the term pre-verbal thinking.
She wrote this very, very interesting paper about the proto-language that children have. And I've always speculated that she was actually talking possibly about the language that we have in the right rather than the left cerebral hemisphere, and that this is what we originally talk with, and this was what she originally understood, and it's an artistic language or a musical one or something of that sort. It isn't a conceptual, intellectual one.
The whole world of pre-verbal thinking does not disappear when language is achieved. It tends to go underground. For most of us it becomes the unconscious or unconscious functioning, and we are really unable to make contact with it. It needs an instrument like the world with sand and moldable sand to enable this sort of thing to be expressed. It can't be expressed at all in language.
Language can express only one aspect of an experience at a time. Pre-verbal thought, by contrast, is multidimensional. Worlds expressing pre-verbal thought show elements from different time periods happening simultaneously and movement taking place on several planes at once. There's no distinction made about time or about space. In addition, the products of pre-verbal thinking often take the form of clusters, a blending of sensory experiences. A cluster includes movement, both internally and externally felt, with an intense emotion, so that the items cannot be separated but form a specific grouping. As a result, pre-verbal thinking is highly idiosyncratic. While the words of language have standardized meanings, the images of pre-verbal thinking are personal, individual, and particularized, and it is virtually impossible to convey these thoughts in words.
I think that for the adult, the easiest way to understand this is to recall those moments when perhaps the smell of something has vividly brought back to full awareness a memory of some event a very long time ago. It doesn't bring it back in sequential form. It brings it back as a total global experience with all the sights and sounds and smells that go with it. For a moment, you are back in that situation. And this happens without your conscious volition. That's the kind of situation that Margaret was talking about when she gave this the title of pre-verbal thinking. And the exploration of pre-verbal thinking was, she regarded, one of her most important contributions to knowledge.
Another important therapeutic tool developed by Dr. Loewenfeld was the mosaic test. Inspired by the geometric designs embroidered on traditional Polish costumes, she made a collection of flat wooden squares, triangles, and diamonds in a variety of colors and persuaded her friends to create designs with them. Gradually, she realized that what people did with the shapes related to what they were like as people.
The response made by the subject, though entirely spontaneous, nevertheless inescapably registers facts about his personality.
During the 1930s, Loewenfeld developed a standardized set of 5 shapes in 6 colors and a method of using them. This came to be known as the Loewenfeld mosaic test. Therese Woodcock is a psychotherapist who trained under Margaret Lowenfeld at the Institute for Child Psychology.
Now, because of the idiosyncratic nature of the mosaic response, what we need to look for is not just the finished product, but the whole process of the making of the mosaic. That is, what do they do when they look at it? How do their hands work? Where's their body? Where are their eyes? What's the expression on their face? So that's the beginning of the mosaic response. And it is the total response that you're required to record, because without that you will not get the flavor of the personality.
Making a mosaic involves the maker in a constant stream of decisions about what to do next. This allows the therapist to observe the child's mind organize material into something meaningful, to watch the child's personality in action. The therapist asks the subject for an explanation of each element of the complete mosaic design and makes a record which is kept for future reference or assessment by an independent observer. Today, the mosaic test is widely used as a diagnostic tool at the beginning of therapy and is repeated at intervals to reveal progress during the course of treatment. In addition, mosaics are often used by children in therapy along with the whirl technique to express thoughts and feelings they cannot put into words.
Now, the way I use the mosaics is quite simply letting the child and the mosaic get together. Because the mosaics have got qualities of its own, which is not entirely created by the child, as in drawing, nor has it got the total particularities that the world figures have, for instance, which is, again, unaltered by the child, but doesn't actually represent as many things that it could. Because if you have a plain red square, you can pour all kinds of feelings, ideas into just that. It's when the person has vague ideas, vague feelings, that they use the mosaic most intelligently, shall we say, most effectively, and it's most therapeutically, because they are also trying to talk to themselves, and using them helps them to think about the problem.
Dr. Theo Abel is a clinical psychologist and a contemporary of Margaret Lowenfeld.
I had one very interesting mosaic from a patient that I was going to see in therapy. What he did was he made a design using different colors and shapes, and he said it was an Aztec symbol that had never been deciphered. So I got the idea that he had some sort of secret because it had never been deciphered. And sure enough, along in therapy after a few sessions, he said, I've come out, I want to tell you something I've never told anybody. And that was when I was 15. I came home from school, I was looking around for my mother, and then I went up to the attic and I found her hanging. And I've never been able to talk about that since. It is interesting that this patient was able to reveal in the mosaic something that he could not reveal otherwise.
Sometimes they act, sometimes they play, sometimes they paint, write stories, or recount dreams and fantasies that come into their heads. The whole burden of treatment does not rest upon worlds and mosaics.
Loewenfeld's work with children at the Institute for Child Psychology that she founded, using the tools that she herself created, provided a wealth of material for study. It was here at the ICP that the first training in child psychotherapy was offered. Courses began in 1935 and were based on Loewenfeld's tools, her theories, and her unique approach to therapy.
It seems to me that we need a breaking down of the concept that children's medicine, experimental psychology, probation work, and education are separate entities, and to attempt instead to study each child as a child and not as a particular kind of child.
Loewenfeld's approach to treatment and training placed a great emphasis on combining research with body and mind therapy.
As soon as she started the ICP, she insisted that every patient coming to the ICP was seen by a physician and a pediatrician. And so she instantly built bridges with the orthodox medical profession and looked at historically. She was lucky in attracting, because of her personality, some extremely well-known pediatricians who worked with the ICP. And of course, they were the more innovative, broad-minded ones rather than the orthodox ones who weren't interested in psychology anyway. And the last of these was probably Professor Davis at Cambridge, who was on the council of the ICP.
But there was a large group of physiotherapists there, and she thought it was very important aspect of the treatment that the children got physiotherapy, and also that she watched them while they did it to see, so to speak, in what way their state of mind was inhibiting their movements or directing their movements into expressing that, rather than having the freedom that she wanted them ultimately to attain.
Loewenfeld's team approach included physiotherapists, psychologists, social workers, and physicians. It examined the relationship of environment, mind, and body, and became an innovative, holistic approach to treatment.
I am not designing an attack upon the doctrines or the procedure of psychoanalysis. As the universe presents itself to me, the human mind is too wide for any one system of thought or observation to exhaust its meaning. My own work is complementary to, and not in opposition to, the work of psychoanalysis.
The strength of her character, I think, comes over particularly in the way in which she was always attuned to the unique and the original in her child patients. And I think that it's that reason is really one reason why she was unhappy with the idea of, for instance, taking a body of theory like psychoanalysis and trying to fit every child into the same pattern.
One of the most vivid memories that I bring from those years is the memory of seeing her working with children. The way that this quite extraordinary woman would change when she was with a child. I think one of the key things about this is the sort of face and hands that she had. And the way she could gesture something was very, very telling. And these hands had a life of their own. You could watch the hands with as much fascination as you could watch her face. But when she was with the child, she still stilled all that. And the animation would leave her face, and she would be left with something I can only describe as an expression like a benevolent sphinx. She was a wonderful observer. I mean, this is perhaps one of the most important things about her, is that she had been trained in observation.
When I first met Margaret Lowenfeld, I found her charming.
Rhoda Matreau is an anthropologist who worked with Margaret Mead and Margaret Lowenfeld.
After dinner, while we were sitting in the living room with a coffee table, my young son, Daniel, who was not quite 2, was playing with his toys under the table and around the table, and I saw Margaret Lowenfeld looking at him here, looking at him there. And after a few minutes, she said to me, "Do you know that your son is ambi-eyed, ambi-handed, and ambi-footed, and that makes him a very unusual child?" And I said, well, I didn't know that. But what I said to myself was, my goodness, she is an extraordinary observer of children.
If you'd seen her working with the child, she would afterwards recount to you everything that she had said and felt, everything the child had said and done, what she understood the child to be doing through his play, what was going on around, and what other children were doing at the same time. An extraordinary ability to take in all the facets of a situation simultaneously.
Christine Heath is a therapist who trained at the ICP.
I think what I learned from watching Margaret Lowenfeld work was her attitude to the child that she was working with. A very close quality of attention to what the child was saying, what the child was doing. Reverence is the wrong word, but a very serious attention paid to the child, so that everything that the child did was taken absolutely seriously and considered very closely and very carefully.
Margaret Lowenfeld was indeed a pioneer in the field of child psychotherapy. The tools she created for communication, the theories and concepts she defined, and the technique of therapy she developed are a lasting legacy and have helped to extend the frontiers of knowledge in psychotherapy. Margaret Mead wrote, "Lowenfeld was one of the great pioneers in the discovery of childhood."
It seems that the time is ripe, that people are realizing that Margaret Lowenfeld's ideas and Margaret Lowenfeld's techniques are valuable in today's world and can be adapted and used on a much broader basis.
It surely required a tremendous tenacity and courage and originality at that time to be not only so influential in actually creating the space for child psychotherapy, but doing it within a world of medicine which was still very dominated by men.
It really is to do with how she composed herself to listen to you. And that gave me the most deepest understanding of what it is like to be a child in front of a stranger and to be in therapy.
The memories really that I carry are of her as a teacher. Her as a teacher, not only just of techniques and things like that, but inspiring one with a certain attitude, a certain approach to the work, a certain intellectual curiosity about all the other ways that there might be to look at, to think about, to understand what is in front of you. I think that's one of the most important things that she ever taught me, which was, keep on learning. You've never exhausted all the truth yet.
For me, the most important contribution that Margaret Lowenfeld made to the field of child psychotherapy was to keep always in view the non-verbal workings of a child's mind, That's the thing that I feel should not be forgotten, should not be lost.